The world just held its breath, and the Strait of Hormuz blinked first. Right now, as you're watching this, the most consequential 48 hours in Middle Eastern history since the fall of Baghdad in 2003 have just unfolded in real time, and most Americans are still trying to figure out what actually happened, and more importantly, what it means for them, for their gas prices, for their economy, and for the future of American power in the world. This is not a simple story of a deal that was made. This is a story about coercion, leverage, and the brutal mechanics of how nations avoid obliteration when they're staring down the barrel of a gun. Let me walk you through this with the kind of clarity that most of the media is not giving you, because there's a deeper game being played here, and you deserve to understand every single layer of it. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a joint military operation, codenamed Operation Epic Fury on the American side, consisting of nearly 900 strikes in just the first 12 hours, targeting Iran's nuclear facilities, ballistic missile infrastructure, and its leadership. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening salvo, along with dozens of other top Iranian officials, triggering a torrent of retaliatory missiles and thousands of drones from Iran across the Middle East, and Iran's immediate closure of the Strait of Hormuz, disrupting global trade at a scale the world had never witnessed. That was the starting gun. Everything that happened between then and April 7th, every ultimatum, every deadline, every threatened strike, was a consequence of that single earth-shattering decision to decapitate an entire regime while it was still sitting at the negotiating table. Now think about that for a moment. Think about what it actually means when a country's supreme leader is killed while his own foreign minister is telling the world on record that a historic agreement is within reach. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, just days before the strikes, stated publicly that a diplomatic resolution was imminent and that diplomacy must be prioritized to avoid further escalation. And then the bombs fell, not after a breakdown in talks, not after Iran fired first, during the negotiations. That is the foundational moral and strategic context that the American media has largely buried, and it is essential to understanding why Iran did exactly what it did next. Iran's IRGC issued warnings forbidding passage through the Strait of Hormuz, which halted almost all shipping traffic, and Iran launched 21 confirmed attacks on merchant ships and reportedly laid sea mines in the strait. Now you hear the word Strait of Hormuz and your eyes might glaze over, but let me make this real for you. Until the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran, about 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas passed through that body of water. 20% of the world's oil supply gone overnight, and the consequences for the American consumer were immediate and brutal. U.S. gas prices soared to a national average of $4.14 a gallon, a near 39% increase since the war began at the end of February, rising from $2.98 on February 26th. That's not a foreign policy problem. That's a kitchen table problem. That's every family in Ohio, in Texas, in Florida, in Michigan, feeling this war in their wallet every single time they pull up to a gas station. And here's where you have to understand the second layer of this story, because this is where it gets genuinely sophisticated. Iran didn't close the strait because it was throwing a tantrum. Iran closed the strait because it was the only weapon it had left that could inflict immediate, measurable pain on the entire Western-aligned global economic order without firing a single missile at an American soldier. That's strategy. That's calculated, cold, hard strategic leverage. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the slain Ali Khamenei, reinforced from the very beginning that the Strait of Hormuz would remain closed and used as leverage against Iran's adversaries, turning a regional military conflict into a global economic crisis. This is exactly what any serious military strategist would have predicted. When you decapitate a regime, when you eliminate its conventional deterrence, the remnants of that regime will reach for whatever asymmetric tool still has teeth, and the Strait of Hormuz has enormous teeth. For weeks, Trump pressured key U.S. allies, including NATO members and countries like Japan and South Korea, to join in the fight and reopen the strait. He predicted that many countries would send warships, but none moved to do so beyond defensive maneuvers. That is a profoundly important detail. The United States, with the most powerful military on the face of the earth, could not convince a single meaningful ally to actively join it in forcing the strait open. Not one. The coalition that was supposed to form around this operation simply did not materialize. Britain offered defensive postures. France watched from the sidelines. Japan and South Korea, who depend enormously on Gulf oil, quietly told Washington they wanted this resolved diplomatically. And that diplomatic isolation began to have consequences for Trump domestically, too. Trump faced domestic criticism, including from within his conservative base over the skyrocketing gas prices caused by Iran's blockade. So let's be honest about what the deadline of April 7th actually represented. By the time Trump set that 8 p.m., deadline demanding Iran open the strait or face the destruction of every power plant and every bridge in the country, he had already pushed back the date of his planned attack multiple times. On March 23rd, he postponed it for 5 days, citing progress in negotiations. And on March 30th, he threatened Iran's energy grid again before pulling back once more. What does that tell you? It tells you that even the most hawkish administration in a generation was wrestling with the real-world consequences of escalating a war with a nation of 85 million people into the destruction of civilian infrastructure on a biblical scale, because that's what this threat was. Trump didn't threaten to hit military targets. He threatened to destroy Iran's power plants and bridges, civilian infrastructure, and earlier posted the demand that Iran open the fucking strait, backing it with a threat that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. That language is not the language of a man with a clear strategic endgame. That is the language of maximum pressure politics being used as a negotiating sledgehammer. And then, 90 minutes before the bombs were supposed to fall, everything changed. Just 90 minutes before Trump's 8 p.m. deadline to wipe out a whole civilization with massive strikes on Iran's energy infrastructure and bridges, he granted a 2-week extension for diplomacy to continue. And the reason why is as important as the outcome itself. It was Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir who reached out to Trump and asked him to hold off. Pakistan, a nuclear-armed Muslim-majority nation with deep ties to both Washington and the wider Islamic world, a country that has been quietly serving as the back channel throughout this entire crisis. The fact that it was Pakistan and not a European ally, not a Gulf state, not the United Nations, but Pakistan that brokered this pause is itself a geopolitical story of staggering significance. It tells you everything about how the traditional architecture of American diplomatic power has shifted and where the actual leverage in this crisis sits. Iran put forward a 10-point peace proposal that included withdrawing U.S. combat forces from all regional bases, lifting all sanctions, releasing Iranian assets frozen abroad, full payment of Iran's war-related damages, and a protocol for controlled passage through the Strait of Hormuz. And here's the remarkable thing. Trump, who just days earlier had called Iran's proposals not good enough, turned around and described this same framework as a workable basis on which to negotiate. What changed in those intervening hours? Nobody knows definitively. But what we can say is that the military reality on the ground, the economic reality on Main Street America, and the diplomatic reality of complete Allied isolation all converged at the same moment to tell the Trump administration that the cost of pushing the button that night was simply too high. The markets told the story instantly. Oil prices plunged after Trump announced the pause, with U.S. crude sliding 8% to around $103 per barrel after having traded as high as $117 earlier that day. S&P futures ripped higher by more than 1.6%, NASDAQ 100 futures soared 1.8%, and Dow futures were up 725 points. The global financial system exhaled in one collective breath. That market reaction is not just a data point, it is a verdict. It is the entire global economy screaming at you that this crisis has been one of the most destabilizing events in the history of international oil markets, and that the mere pause of 2 weeks is enough to produce a historic one-day swing in commodity prices. But let's not romanticize what we actually have here, because this is where the analytical discipline matters most. Uncertainty clouds the ceasefire and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran said safe passage through the strait during the 2-week period would only be possible via coordination with Iran's armed forces and with due consideration of technical limitations. That is not an unconditional reopening. That is Iran maintaining sovereign control over who passes through and on what terms. The White House insisted the strait must be open without limitation, including tolls, and White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said Iran would cross a red line if it attempted to charge ships to pass through the vital oil route. So already, within hours of the agreement being announced, the two sides are not agreeing on what the agreement actually says. That is a fundamental problem. That is not the foundation of a durable peace. That is a 48-hour reprieve dressed up as a diplomatic breakthrough. At least 2 vessels passed through the strait in the hours since Iran and the U.S. reached the ceasefire deal, but they were described as bulk carriers carrying dry cargo, not oil. Overall traffic through the vital waterway had not picked up beyond the slow trickle it had experienced throughout the war. The maritime industry remained deeply uncertain, despite Iran's assurances, because the shipping industry runs on predictability, on insurance coverage, on war risk premiums, and on hard contractual certainty. None of those things exist yet. You need sustained, verifiable free passage for weeks before oil tanker captains and their insurers will begin to normalize operations through that choke point again. Two bulk carriers passing through is a symbol. It is not a solution. And then there's Lebanon. Lebanon is not part of the 2-week ceasefire between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, according to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office. The Israeli military struck a 7th key crossing point over the Litani River, linking Lebanon south to the rest of the country, continuing its operations even after the ceasefire announcement. So while Washington and Tehran are toasting a pause, a parallel war is continuing on Lebanese soil with Israeli ground and aerial operations, over 1,700 people already killed, and Hezbollah still firing back. A ceasefire that doesn't cover Lebanon is not a ceasefire in the broader sense of the word. It is a partial pause in one theater of a multi-theater war, and partial pauses have a well-documented historical tendency to unravel completely. The first round of negotiations during the ceasefire is set to take place in Islamabad, led on the U.S. side by Vice President J.D. Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner. And here you have to hold two thoughts in your head simultaneously. On one hand, the fact that talks are happening at all, that an American vice president is flying to Pakistan to sit across from Iranian negotiators, is a meaningful de-escalation from the brink. On the other hand, Iran's negotiating position is built on a foundation of deep and entirely rational mistrust. Senior Iranian regime figures repeatedly voiced their reluctance to trust the U.S. in negotiations, pointing out that Iran had been attacked while it was negotiating with Washington when the war began. And that is not propaganda. That is a documented fact. Iran was sitting at the Geneva negotiating table when the bombs fell. You cannot ask a country to negotiate in good faith when its last experience of American negotiating was ending with the assassination of its supreme leader. Iran's Supreme National Security Council hinted in a separate statement that the ceasefire could be extended beyond its initial 2 weeks if negotiations proceed favorably. That is a door left slightly open. It is Iran signaling that it is not committed to a permanent posture of total confrontation. That signal matters because the alternative, a complete breakdown of talks after 2 weeks, a resumption of the blockade, oil at $130 a barrel, and Trump facing the same decision he flinched at on April 7th, is a scenario that benefits no one on earth. Not the United States, not Iran, not the global economy that is already reeling from 5 weeks of this conflict. What you are watching in real time is the brutal renegotiation of American power in the Middle East. The old architecture where the U.S. could threaten military action, rally a coalition, and force compliance did not perform as advertised. No ally joined the coalition to reopen the strait. The economic pain flowed back to American consumers faster than expected. The military option was prepared and then stood down not once, not twice, but multiple times. That is not strength. That is the painful, complicated reality of a superpower confronting the limits of what military force can actually achieve in the 21st century. Trump himself floated the possibility of joint U.S.-Iranian control of the strait, telling a reporter last month, "It'll be jointly controlled. Me and the Ayatollah, whoever the Ayatollah is, whoever the next Ayatollah is." Think about what that sentence means. The President of the United States, the leader of the nation that launched Operation Epic Fury to destroy Iran's military capacity and eliminate its supreme leader, is now floating the idea of co-managing the world's most critical oil choke point in partnership with the government of the country he just went to war with. That is not a victory lap. That is a tacit acknowledgement that Iran, even after losing its founding supreme leader, even after 6 weeks of devastating strikes, still holds enough leverage in that narrow body of water to force the most powerful military in history to the negotiating table. The 2 weeks ahead are going to tell us everything about what kind of world we are actually living in. Both the U.S. and Iran framed the ceasefire development as a win, and that dual framing is, in its own way, the most honest thing either government has said throughout this entire conflict, because a true victory would not require both sides to spin it as their own triumph. A true victory would be visible and undeniable. What we have instead is a mutual recognition that the next step, the actual escalation to the destruction of Iranian civilian infrastructure on a massive scale, was a line that neither side was prepared to cross on April 7th, 2026. That is not peace. That is a pause. And the difference between those two things is everything.